My name is Mia Collins. I'm 32 years old, and I never thought I'd stand in a courtroom watching my own uncle mock me, like I was still that scared little girl he used to bully at family dinners. But when the judge asked me to confirm my current profession, and I said those three letters, CEO, the color drained from his face so fast, I thought he might actually faint right there in front of everyone. You won't believe what happened next, because what started as his attempt to humiliate me turned into the most satisfying moment of my entire life. And honestly, my uncle mocked my testimony until my new CEO title turned the room ice cold. Let me know in the comments where you're watching. If this story is hitting close to home, hit that subscribe button and drop a like. You're going to want to see how this unfolds. The thing about being dismissed your whole life is that people get comfortable thinking you'll never rise above their expectation. And my uncle had spent decades perfecting the art of making me feel small, insignificant, like my words carried no weight in any room I entered. He'd interrupt me mid-sentence at Thanksgiving dinners, laugh when I shared my opinions about anything serious, and even told other family members that I had an overactive imagination whenever I dared to speak up about things that mattered. That courtroom was supposed to be his final victory, the place where he'd publicly discredit me one last time, where he'd paint me as the delusional niece who couldn't be trusted. But he made one critical mistake. He underestimated how much I had grown, how much I had learned, and how deeply my grandfather had believed in me when no one else did. The moment I walked into that courtroom, I could feel his eyes on me, that same condescending smirk playing at the corners of his mouth like he was watching a comedy show instead of a legal proceeding that would determine the future of everything my grandfather built. My hands were trembling slightly as I took my seat, not from fear, but from the adrenaline of knowing that everything was about to change, that the power dynamic that had defined our relationship for 3 decades was about to shatter like glass hitting concrete. He leaned over to his lawyer and whispered something, and they both chuckled quietly, probably making some joke about how this would be quick and easy, how I'd crumble under pressure like I always had before. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I had spent the last 18 months preparing for this exact moment, gathering evidence, building my case, and stepping into a role that would make every single lie he told about me completely irrelevant. Little did I know then that his laughter would be the last sound of confidence he'd make that day. Growing up in my family felt like living in a constant state of invisibility, where my voice was just background noise that people tolerated but never actually heard or valued. Every opinion I shared was met with dismissive nods. Every achievement I celebrated was minimized with comments like, "That's nice, honey," before they moved on to talk about someone else's accomplishment. And every time I tried to stand up for myself, I was labeled as too sensitive or dramatic, as if my feelings were somehow less legitimate than everyone else's. My Uncle David was the worst of them all. He had this way of looking right through me when I spoke, like I was transparent, like my words were just air passing through the room without leaving any impact whatsoever. He'd train me, whether intentionally or not, to doubt every instinct I had, to second-guess every truth I knew, to question whether my reality was even real or just another one of my fantasies that he loved to point out at family gatherings. The emotional scars from that kind of treatment run deeper than most people realize, because it's not just about being ignored. It's about having your entire sense of self slowly eroded until you start believing that maybe they're right, maybe you don't deserve to be heard. I remember being 14 and coming home excited about winning a writing competition at school, and my Uncle David was visiting that weekend, sitting in our living room with his feet up on the coffee table like he owned the place. When I told everyone about my award, he barely looked up from his phone before saying, "Writing's not a real skill, Mia. You should focus on something practical." And then he went right back to scrolling while my parents just nodded along like he'd said something profound instead of crushing. That moment stuck with me for years, became part of a collection of memories that taught me my voice didn't matter, that my truth was always up for debate, that I should just stay quiet and let the important people do the talking. Today, I'm going to tell you exactly how I reclaimed that voice, how I took back every ounce of power they'd stolen from me, and how one simple title, 3 letters that changed everything, turned my uncle's mockery into the most uncomfortable silence he's ever experienced. But before I get into the courtroom drama, you need to understand the full context of what led us there, because this wasn't just about an inheritance dispute or family drama. This was about decades of systemic dismissal, of being treated like my perspective was optional, like my experiences could be rewritten by whoever shouted loudest. My uncle had perfected this strategy over years. He'd tell stories about me that painted me as unreliable, forgetful, prone to exaggeration. And he'd do it with such confidence that even I started wondering if his version of events was more accurate than my own memory. He'd say things like, "Oh, Mia remembers it differently, but here's what actually happened," and then proceed to tell a completely distorted version that made me look foolish or confused. The worst part wasn't even the lies themselves. It was watching other family members nod along, accept his narrative without question, and treat me like I needed to be corrected rather than believed. What happened next shocked everyone, including me, because the truth I'd been carrying all those years was about to surface in a way that no one could deny, dismiss, or rewrite. The pattern started so early in my childhood that I can barely remember a time when it wasn't there, woven into every family interaction like an invisible script everyone had memorized except me. I'd tell my parents about something that happened at school, a teacher who said something hurtful, a friend who betrayed my trust, anything that mattered to my 8-year-old heart, and before I could even finish my sentence, someone would interrupt with their own story or change the subject entirely as if I hadn't spoken at all. My Uncle David had a special talent for this. He'd wait until I was mid-sentence, lean back in his chair with this amused expression, and say something like, "Here we go again with another one of Mia's stories," emphasizing the word stories like I was a novelist spinning fiction instead of a child trying to share her reality. The message was clear every single time. My truth was negotiable, my experiences were up for interpretation, and most importantly, I couldn't be trusted to accurately report what happened in my own life. Before I continue, make sure you're subscribed, because what happens next is absolutely insane. And leave a like if you've ever felt like nobody in your family actually listens. What made this dynamic particularly toxic was how subtle and consistent it was. There were no dramatic blowups or obvious cruelty that I could point to and say, "This is abuse." Just a steady drip of dismissal that accumulated over years until I genuinely believed something was wrong with me. When I was 12, I tried to tell my mom that I'd seen my Uncle David taking money from my grandfather's wallet when he thought no one was looking. And instead of investigating or even asking questions, she pulled me aside and said, "Mia, honey, you need to stop making up things about people. Uncle David would never do that. And it's not nice to accuse family members of stealing." I remember the shame that washed over me in that moment, the burning humiliation of being called a liar when I knew exactly what I'd seen, and the creeping doubt that maybe my eyes had played tricks on me. Maybe I'd misunderstood the situation. That incident became a reference point my uncle would bring up for years afterward whenever I said anything remotely controversial. "Remember when Mia accused me of stealing? She's got quite the imagination." The most damaging part of growing up dismissed isn't the big moment. It's the thousands of tiny interactions that teach you to stay silent, to swallow your truth, to accept other people's versions of reality, even when they contradict what you know to be true. I learned to preface everything I said with phrases like, "I might be wrong, but," or "maybe I'm remembering this incorrectly," because those qualifiers seem to make people more willing to listen, even though they also reinforce the idea that my perspective was inherently unreliable. My Uncle David loved those moments of self-doubt. I could see satisfaction flash across his face whenever I second-guessed myself in front of others, like he'd successfully trained me to question my own mind. Family gatherings became performances where I played the role of the uncertain, slightly confused niece who couldn't quite get her facts straight, while he played the patient, reasonable uncle who had to constantly correct my misperception. But what he didn't realize, what none of them realized, was that every dismissal, every eye roll, every time they chose his word over mine, was building something inside me that would eventually become unshakable, a burning need to prove, once and for all, that I had been right all along. When my grandfather passed away on a cold November morning, I felt like I'd lost the only person in my family who actually saw me as a complete human being, rather than a supporting character in everyone else's story. He'd been sick for months, and I'd spent as much time as I could at his bedside, holding his weathered hand and listening to him share memories from his life, stories about building his business from nothing, about the mistakes he'd made, about the people who'd tried to take advantage of him over the years. In those final weeks, he seemed urgent, almost desperate to tell me specific things, but the medication made him drift in and out of consciousness, and I could never quite piece together what he was trying to communicate. The day after the funeral, my Uncle David called a family meeting at my grandfather's house, the same house where I'd spent countless weekends as a child, where I'd learned to bake cookies in that massive kitchen, where I'd hidden in the library reading books while adults argued about business and money in the rooms below. I walked into that meeting expecting grief, maybe some discussion about memorial arrangements, perhaps dividing up personal items that held sentimental value for different family members. What I got instead was my Uncle David sitting at the head of my grandfather's dining table, the same seat my grandfather had occupied for 40 years, with a stack of papers in front of him and an expression that I can only describe as triumphant. "I know this is difficult timing," he started, his voice dripping with fake sympathy that made my skin crawl. "But we need to discuss the estate, and I want everyone to understand the situation clearly, so there's no confusion later." He proceeded to outline how my grandfather's assets would be distributed. The house would go to him as the eldest son, the business would be dissolved and sold with profits split among the immediate family, and various accounts and investments would be divided according to what he claimed was my grandfather's wishes. I sat there listening, waiting for my name to be mentioned, waiting for some acknowledgement that I'd spent more time with my grandfather in his final year than anyone else in that room. The trap revealed itself slowly. Like watching storm clouds gather before the downpour hits, my uncle explained that my grandfather had been very clear about wanting to keep things simple, that he'd expressed concern about me being too young and inexperienced to handle any significant inheritance, that he'd specifically requested I receive only a small monetary gift for sentimental purposes. Every word felt like a slap, especially because I could hear my grandfather's voice in my head saying the exact opposite during our conversation, telling me things like, "You're going to do great things, Mia, and don't let anyone convince you that you're not capable." But there I was again, in the same position I'd been my whole life. My truth versus their narrative, my memory versus their official version, and absolutely no one in that room looking at me like they believed I might have a different understanding of what my grandfather actually wanted. My uncle pushed a single envelope across the table toward me, and I could see other family members exchanging knowing glances, like they'd already discussed this among themselves and decided I should just be grateful for whatever scraps they were willing to throw my way. I left that family meeting with the envelope still sealed in my purse, feeling like I'd just witnessed a carefully orchestrated performance where everyone knew their lines except me. Something felt fundamentally wrong about the entire situation, not just the dismissive way my uncle had handled everything, but the specific details he'd shared about my grandfather's supposed wishes that contradicted conversations I'd had with him just weeks before his death. That night, I couldn't sleep, tossing and turning as fragments of memories played through my mind like puzzle pieces that didn't quite fit together. My grandfather squeezing my hand with surprising strength during one of our last conversations and whispering, "Everything you need is already there, Mia. You just have to look in the right places." At the time, I thought he was being metaphorical, talking about inner strength or self-belief, but now those words echoed differently, carrying weight I hadn't recognized before. I found myself pulled back to his house at 2 a.m, using the key he'd given me years ago, walking through rooms that still smelled like his cologne and pipe tobacco. The study was exactly as he'd left it, books stacked on every available surface, papers scattered across his massive oak desk, photographs of family covering the walls like a timeline of our collective history. I stood in the doorway remembering all the times I'd found him, working late into the night, and how he'd always make time to explain what he was doing, treating me like a colleague rather than a child who couldn't possibly understand business concepts. My eyes landed on a painting of the ocean that had hung above his desk for as long as I could remember, and suddenly I recalled something strange. During one of our last visits, he'd stared at that painting for a long time before saying, "Some of the most valuable things in life are hidden in plain sight, protected by our assumptions about what matters." I approached the painting slowly, my heart hammering in my chest, and when I lifted it off the wall, I found exactly what my intuition had been screaming about: a small wall safe with a keypad, and taped to the back of the painting frame was a note in my grandfather's handwriting that simply read, "Your birthday?" backwards. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely punch in the numbers. 23CU4 instead of 4032. And when the safe door swung open with a quiet click, I literally had to sit down on the floor because my legs couldn't support me anymore. Inside was a leather portfolio embossed with my grandfather's initials, and the moment I opened it, I understood why my uncle had been so confident in that family meeting, why he'd felt comfortable rewriting history so brazenly. The first document was a will, the real will, dated just 6 months before my grandfather's death, and it was notarized, witnessed, and absolutely legitimate in ways that made my uncle's version look like amateur fiction. But it wasn't just the will that made my breath catch in my throat. It was the letters addressed to me, dozens of them written over the past decade, explaining his plans, his reasoning, his hopes for my future, and most importantly, his warnings about the exact scenario that was now unfolding. One letter in particular, dated 3 months before he died, contained a sentence that would change everything. "Mia, I've watched you grow into someone I trust with my life's work, and I've spent the last 10 years quietly preparing you for leadership while keeping David and the others distracted with the business they think they understand. Reading through those letters felt like watching my entire childhood and young adulthood recontextualized in real time, like discovering that what I thought was random had actually been carefully orchestrated all along. My grandfather detailed every conversation we'd had about business strategy, every casual discussion about leadership and decision-making, every time he'd asked my opinion on company matters that I'd thought were just hypothetical exercises meant to make me feel included. "You probably didn't realize it," he wrote in one letter, "but every Sunday dinner where I asked you to analyze a business problem wasn't just small talk. I was teaching you to think like a CEO, to see patterns others miss, to question assumptions that everyone else accepts as truth." He explained how he deliberately kept this mentorship quiet because he knew David would sabotage it if he suspected I was being groomed for real responsibility. How he'd watched my uncle's resentment grow over the years whenever anyone suggested I might be capable of more than they'd decided I could handle. If you're loving this twist, smash that subscribe button and hit the like. You need to see what I discovered next because it gets even crazier. The training had been comprehensive in ways I'd never consciously recognized. Those summers I'd spent helping out at the office weren't just filing papers and making coffee like I'd thought. My grandfather had been giving me access to every department, letting me observe operate, introducing me to key clients and partners who would later become crucial to my transition into leadership. He'd taken me to board meetings starting when I was 16, always presenting it as bringing my granddaughter to learn about business. But now I realized he'd been positioning me, making my face familiar, establishing my presence in rooms where decisions were made. One letter contained a list of every major business lesson he'd embedded in our conversations, from always verify information yourself rather than trusting someone else's summary, which he'd taught me after the incident where my uncle claimed I'd accused him of stealing, to the person who controls the narrative controls the outcome, which he'd explained through stories about negotiations and deals he'd closed over the decade. But the most shocking revelation was in the final letter he'd written, dated just 2 weeks before his death, where his handwriting was shaky, but his message was crystal clear. "Mia, I'm naming you CEO of Collins Enterprises, effective immediately upon my death, and I've structured everything legally, so David cannot contest this decision without exposing himself to criminal fraud charges for the financial manipulation I've documented over the past 5 years." He went on to explain how he'd discovered my uncle had been slowly embezzling from the company, how he'd gathered evidence meticulously while pretending not to notice, how he'd used that leverage to ensure my uncle would have to accept my leadership or face prosecution. The portfolio contained copies of altered invoices, falsified expense reports, emails where David discussed moving money through shell companies, and even recordings from security cameras showing him accessing accounts he wasn't authorized to touch. My grandfather had built an ironclad case while simultaneously training me to lead, and he'd done it all in plain sight while everyone, including me, thought he was just being a doting grandfather who indulged my interest in his work. Walking into Collins Enterprises as anything other than the granddaughter who sometimes helps out felt surreal, like I was stepping into an alternate version of my own life, where people actually had to listen to what I said. The board meeting where my grandfather's lawyer announced my appointment as CEO was tense but controlled. The documentation was so thorough, the legal groundwork so solid, that no one could openly object without immediately exposing themselves to scrutiny they clearly didn't want. Some board members looked confused, a few looked skeptical, but several gave me small nods of recognition. People who remembered those casual board meetings I'd attended as a teenager, who'd apparently understood my grandfather's intentions long before I did. I kept my expression calm, my voice steady, and inside I repeated one sentence over and over. "You are not that invisible girl anymore." The one person not in that room was my Uncle David, and that was deliberate. The lawyer explained privately that my grandfather had insisted on a specific sequence. First, formalize my appointment, then secure the company's critical assets, and only after that inform David of the changes, knowing he'd react emotionally and possibly recklessly. The weeks that followed were some of the busiest of my life. I met with department heads, reviewed financials, confirmed key contracts, and quietly reinforced internal controls my grandfather had begun putting in place before he got sick. To the outside world, it looked like a smooth leadership transition within a family-owned business. Inside, it felt like stepping onto a battlefield my grandfather had mapped out years before, following a strategy he'd drawn up while everyone else underestimated both of us. I worked long days and longer nights, fueled less by revenge and more by a fierce determination not to waste the trust he'd placed in me. I made one very intentional choice during that period. I didn't tell a single family member, including my parents, about my new role. Every time I thought about calling my mom, I pictured her uncertain expression, the way she'd always defaulted to believing David whenever there was a conflict, and I realized I needed time to build my own foundation before dealing with their reaction. Instead, I focused on competence, showing the team, the board, and myself that I could actually do this job, not just inherit the title. 3 months into my tenure, revenue was up. A major partnership had been renewed under better terms, and an internal audit had quietly confirmed everything my grandfather had documented about David's financial misconduct. I knew that sooner or later, he'd come for what he thought was his, and when he did, I needed to be ready, not just as the girl he used to mock, but as the woman now legally, ethically, and practically in charge of everything he believed should have belonged to him. Little did I know his first move wouldn't be a business attack. It would be something far more personal and far more public. The first official sign that my family was moving against me came in the form of a polite-looking letter that did not match the venom inside it. It was from an attorney representing my Uncle David and 2 other relatives, framed as an invitation to discuss concerns regarding the administration of the Collins estate. But the subtext was obvious. They were accusing me of manipulating my grandfather and unfairly influencing his final decision. Reading those words made my stomach twist, not because they were true, but because they were a perfect reflection of the narrative David had been crafting about me since childhood, that I was unreliable, dramatic, prone to exaggeration and fantasy. Now he'd simply upgraded the vocabulary and put it on legal letterhead. What he hadn't counted on was that I'd opened that safe, read those letters, and seen every piece of evidence my grandfather had assembled long before his final illness. A few days later, things escalated. I learned from my grandfather's lawyer that my uncle had produced an older version of the will, one my grandfather had written years before my training really began, claiming it was the true document and that the newer one I held was either forged or created under undue influence. On top of that, we discovered that someone had attempted to alter digital records of company ownership, trying to backdate changes that would shift control away from me and back toward David. The forensics team made quick work of unraveling those attempts, tracing logins, timestamps, and IP addresses that painted a clear picture of deliberate, coordinated fraud. It was almost absurd. The same man who'd spent my entire life telling everyone I exaggerated now had his name attached to a trail of cold, hard facts that showed exactly who'd been twisting reality to suit himself. As more details came to light, it became clear this wasn't just David acting alone. A small cluster of family members had aligned themselves behind him, convinced that I was overstepping, that I must have manipulated a dying old man into giving me what they thought belonged to them by default. They'd built a whole story in their heads about me as this scheming, ungrateful granddaughter who'd swooped in at the last moment to steal the empire they believed David had earned simply by being the eldest son. Rather than talk to me, ask questions, or even try to understand my grandfather's reasoning, they went directly to lawyers, to threats, to backroom maneuvering. When my attorney told me they were pushing for a full court hearing to challenge the will and my role at the company, I felt a strange calm settle over me. Not because I enjoyed conflict, but because for the first time in my life, the arena wouldn't be a living room where David controlled the story. It would be a courtroom, bound by evidence, procedure, and truth that couldn't be shouted down or laughed away. And that was exactly where everything began to turn. The courthouse felt colder than it should have been for late spring, or maybe that was just the ice in my veins as I walked past family members who wouldn't make eye contact with me in the hallway. My Uncle David stood near the entrance to the courtroom surrounded by his legal team, and when our eyes met, he gave me that same patronizing smile I'd seen 1,000 times before, the one that said he'd already won, that this was just a formality before things went back to the natural order, where he made decisions and I stayed quiet. My hands gripped the handle of my briefcase a little tighter, feeling the weight of all those documents inside, all that evidence my grandfather had carefully compiled, all those years of preparation that David had no idea existed. The bailiff called us in, and as I took my seat at the plaintiff's table, I could hear whispered conversations behind me, family members speculating about how quickly this would be over, how I'd probably just accept a settlement and disappear back into obscurity where I belonged. If you've ever had to face down someone who spent years making you feel small, hit that subscribe button right now and drop a like, because what I'm about to tell you is the sweetest vindication you'll hear all week. When the judge entered and we all rose, I noticed my uncle adjusting his tie with this confident, almost bored expression, like he was attending a routine business meeting rather than a legal proceeding that would determine the future of a multi-million-dollar enterprise. His lawyer opened with a statement painting me as an opportunistic young woman who'd taken advantage of an elderly man's declining mental state, suggesting that my grandfather couldn't possibly have been of sound mind when he made me CEO, because no rational person would bypass his own son for someone so inexperienced and frankly unsuited for leadership. Each word was designed to cut, to diminish, to reinforce every doubt anyone had ever planted in my mind about my own capabilities. I sat there listening, maintaining my composure, knowing that my turn would come and that when it did, the entire room's understanding of the situation was about to shift dramatically. Then came the moment I'd been simultaneously dreading and anticipating. The judge called me to the witness stand to give my testimony about my relationship with my grandfather and the circumstances surrounding his final will. I stood, smoothed my suit jacket, and walked to that wooden chair, feeling every eye in the courtroom tracking my movement, weighing me, judging me, most of them already convinced I was exactly what David had always said I was. As I placed my hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth, I heard my uncle whisper something to his lawyer that was just loud enough for me to catch. This should be entertaining. Let's see what fantasy she comes up with today. The lawyer actually chuckled, a quiet sound that nonetheless carried in the silent courtroom, and several family members in the gallery exchanged knowing looks like they were watching a predictable movie they'd all seen before. That laugh, that dismissive, casual cruelty, lit something inside me that I'd been keeping carefully controlled, and I realized that every moment of my life had been leading to this one, where I would finally, definitively prove that their version of Mia Collins had never been real. I began my testimony exactly as my attorney and I had rehearsed, laying out the timeline of my relationship with my grandfather, the conversations we'd had, the time I'd spent with him, especially in his final year. My voice was steady, clear, and I made sure to look at the judge while I spoke, establishing credibility through direct eye contact and straightforward language that left no room for misinterpretation. But about 5 minutes into my statement, as I was describing how my grandfather had explicitly told me about his intentions for the company, my uncle interrupted with a loud scoff that echoed through the courtroom. "Your Honor," he said, not even bothering to stand properly. "Are we really going to sit here and listen to more of my niece's imaginative storytelling? This is a waste of the court's time." His lawyer tried to quiet him with a hand on his arm, but David was on a roll now, emboldened by years of never facing consequences for dismissing me. The judge's expression hardened, and she directed a sharp look at my uncle before telling him that any further interruptions would result in contempt charges, but the damage to the atmosphere in the room was already done. I could see some family members nodding slightly in agreement with David's outburst, and even a few board members in attendance looked uncomfortable, like they were second-guessing whether I really belonged in that CEO chair after all. David leaned back in his seat with a satisfied smile, having successfully planted doubt exactly where he wanted it. And when the judge told me to continue, he muttered under his breath, loud enough for the court reporter and several nearby people to hear, "She doesn't even have a real job, Your Honor. She's been living off family money her whole life." That statement hung in the air like poison gas, and I watched several faces in the gallery shift from neutral to skeptical, from open to closed, from maybe she's telling the truth to, yeah, David has a point. What my uncle didn't realize in that moment of perceived victory was that he'd just handed me the perfect setup for what came next. His lawyer was frantically flipping through papers, clearly recognizing that David had gone off script and said something that could be easily disproven, but it was too late. The words were in the record, the implication was clear, and everyone in that courtroom now believed they knew exactly who I was, a spoiled, unemployed family member trying to cash in on an inheritance I hadn't earned. I saw my attorney suppress a smile, a tiny twitch at the corner of her mouth that told me she knew we'd just been given a gift. And when the judge asked me directly, "Ms. Collins, before we continue with the substance of your testimony, can you please state for the record your current occupation and source of income?" I felt time slow down in that crystalline way it does before life-changing moments. This was it. The moment where everything shifted, where the narrative David had constructed for 32 years was about to collapse under the weight of a truth so simple, so verifiable, so absolutely undeniable that even he couldn't talk his way around it. I took a slow breath, let the silence stretch for just a second longer than comfortable, and then spoke in the clearest voice I'd used all day. "Your Honor, I am currently the Chief Executive Officer of Collins Enterprises, a position I've held for the past 7 months, following my grandfather's death, and in accordance with his final wishes as documented in his legally executed will." The words landed like a bomb in that courtroom. You could actually hear the collective intake of breath, see heads snapping up from notebooks, watch my uncle's face drain of color so fast I thought he might actually pass out right there at the defendant's table. His mouth opened slightly, forming a perfect O of shock. And for the first time in my entire life, I saw something in his eyes I'd never witnessed before. Absolute, unfiltered fear mixed with the dawning realization that he'd just publicly humiliated himself in front of a judge, a court reporter, and dozens of witnesses. The judge's eyebrows rose slightly, and she glanced down at the case files in front of her, as if confirming what I'd just said, then looked back at me with an expression that had shifted from neutral to distinctly interested. "You're the CEO of the company at the center of this dispute?" she asked, and I could hear the subtext in her question. Why didn't we know this critical fact already, and how did opposing counsel miss something so fundamental to this case? "Yes, Your Honor," I replied, keeping my tone professional and steady, even though my heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. "I was appointed by my grandfather's will and confirmed by the board of directors, and I've been actively managing the company's operations since taking office." Behind me, I heard whispers erupting in the gallery, family members processing this information, some in disbelief, others clearly angry that they'd been kept in the dark, and still others calculating what this meant for their own positions in the family hierarchy that had just been completely upended. My uncle finally found his voice, but it came out strangled and desperate rather than confident. That's not possible. She couldn't have." His lawyer physically grabbed his arm, pulling him back down into his seat and whispering urgently in his ear, probably explaining that every word he said now was making their case worse and confirming exactly what my testimony had established. The silence that followed was so thick, you could have cut it with a knife. It was the sound of an entire room recalibrating, of assumptions shattering, of a narrative that had seemed so solid 5 minutes ago, now revealed as complete fiction. I watched my uncle's hands shake slightly as he reached for his water glass, watched him avoid eye contact with everyone including his own attorney, watched the smug confidence that had defined his posture since we entered the courthouse melt away like snow in summer. This was the moment I'd been working toward without even fully realizing it. Not revenge exactly, but something deeper. The complete, irrevocable proof that everything he'd said about me being incapable, unreliable, unworthy of responsibility was not just wrong, but spectacularly, publicly, legally wrong. The judge called for a brief recess, and when we reconvened 20 minutes later, the energy in the courtroom had fundamentally changed. My uncle's legal team looked like they'd spent the entire break in frantic consultation. My family members sat rigid and uncomfortable in their seats, and the judge's demeanor had shifted from routine procedural oversight to active investigation mode. My attorney stood and requested permission to enter into evidence a series of documents that would clarify the circumstances surrounding Mr. Collins's final will and the appointment of his granddaughter as CEO. And when the judge granted that permission, we began methodically walking through everything my grandfather had left in that safe. First came the letters, not all of them, but carefully selected excerpts that demonstrated a clear, consistent, multi-year pattern of mentorship, intention, and explicit planning for my leadership role that was impossible to dismiss as last-minute confusion or manipulation. The court reporter read portions aloud at the judge's request, and hearing my grandfather's words spoken in that formal setting gave them even more weight than they'd had when I first discovered them in his study. "I have been preparing Mia for executive leadership for over a decade," one letter stated plainly, "not because she is my granddaughter, but because she has demonstrated the analytical skills, emotional intelligence, and ethical foundation that this company will need to thrive in the coming decade." Another excerpt detailed specific business decisions I'd helped him think through, including a major acquisition that had significantly increased the company's value, decisions that had happened years before his final illness, completely undermining any suggestion that I'd only become involved when he was mentally compromised. My uncle sat frozen in his chair, and I could see him doing the math in his head, realizing that all those Sunday dinners and family gatherings where my grandfather and I had discussed business weren't just casual conversation, but documented preparation for exactly this outcome. Then came the financial evidence, and this was where things got truly uncomfortable for everyone on the other side of the courtroom. My attorney presented the forensic accounting reports that detailed years of unauthorized transactions, altered invoices, and suspicious money movement, all linked directly to my Uncle David through timestamps, login credentials, and in some cases, actual security camera footage that my grandfather had apparently been collecting for half a decade. The judge examined each document carefully, her expression growing progressively more severe as the scope of the fraud became clear. And when she asked my uncle's attorney if he had any explanation for these discrepancies, the man actually stammered. An experienced litigator reduced to incoherence because there was simply no plausible defense against that volume of hard evidence. We showed emails where David discussed hiding assets, text messages where he coordinated with an accountant to falsify reports, and most damning of all, a handwritten note from my grandfather to his attorney, dated 2 years before his death, that read, David's theft has become systematic. Document everything. When the time comes, Mia will need this to protect herself and the company. The air went out of my uncle's defense like a punctured balloon, and I watched him age 10 years in that moment, understanding that he hadn't just lost a legal battle, he'd been caught, comprehensively and undeniably, by the very man he'd been stealing from. My uncle's attorney requested a sidebar with the judge, and I watched them huddle near the bench in hushed conversation, while David sat at the table looking like a man watching his entire world crumble in real time. When they returned, the lawyer's face was ashen, and he made a request that confirmed what I'd suspected. He asked for a continuance, claiming he needed time to review these new materials and prepare an adequate response. But the judge wasn't having it. She pointed out with barely concealed irritation that nothing we'd presented was actually new, since all of it had been properly disclosed during discovery, and that his client's failure to take those disclosures seriously wasn't grounds for delay. Your client has had months to prepare for this hearing, she said coolly, and if he chose to ignore evidence that was readily available to him, that's a strategic decision he'll have to live with. The dismissal in her tone was absolute, and I saw several family members exchange uncomfortable glances, finally starting to understand that maybe, just maybe, they'd backed the wrong horse in this race. The judge then did something I hadn't expected. She addressed my uncle directly, asking him if he had anything to say in response to the financial evidence that had just been presented. David opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again like a fish gasping for air, and finally managed to stammer out, "Your Honor, those documents are taken out of context. I can explain." But before he could finish, his own attorney cut him off with a hand on his shoulder, leaning in to whisper urgently in his ear. Whatever he said made David go completely silent, slumping back in his chair with the resignation of someone who'd just been told there was no way out. The judge waited a moment, then said, "Mr. Collins, I'm going to give you one opportunity to address this court honestly. Did you or did you not engage in the financial activities documented in these reports?" The silence that followed was deafening. Everyone in that courtroom leaning forward slightly, waiting to see if he'd try to lie his way out or finally face the truth he'd been running from for years. "I need to consult with my attorney," David finally said, his voice barely above a whisper, and that non-answer told everyone in the room everything they needed to know. The judge's expression hardened even further, and she made a note on her pad before announcing that she was ordering a full audit of Collins Enterprises' financial records for the past 7 years, and that depending on what that audit revealed, she might be referring certain matters to the district attorney's office for potential criminal prosecution. The words criminal prosecution hung in the air like a death sentence, and I watched my uncle's face go from pale to gray, his hands trembling so badly that he had to clasp them together on the table to hide the shaking. Family members who'd been so confident walking into that courtroom now looked horrified, some covering their mouths in shock, others shaking their heads in disbelief that their golden child, their reliable eldest son, their supposedly trustworthy family leader, had been systematically stealing from the company for years, while simultaneously painting me as the unreliable one. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, and I could see the exact moment when several of them realized they owed me an apology they'd probably never have the courage to give. The judge ruled in my favor that day, upholding my grandfather's will in its entirety and confirming my position as CEO without reservation or limitation. But sitting in my car afterward, hands still gripping the steering wheel, even though I hadn't started the engine yet, I realized that the victory wasn't really about the title, the company, or even proving my uncle wrong. It was about something much more fundamental to who I'd become. For 32 years, I'd been trained to doubt my own reality, to question my perception, to accept other people's versions of truth even when they contradicted everything I knew to be real. That courtroom hadn't just vindicated my legal right to lead Collins Enterprises, it had vindicated every moment I trusted my instinct. Every time I'd held on to my truth, even when everyone around me suggested I was wrong. Every quiet act of resistance against a narrative designed to keep me small and silent. In the weeks following the trial, I had several family members reach out with apologies that ranged from genuine to performative, from heartfelt to clearly self-serving. My mother called crying, saying she'd never realized how deeply David's influence had shaped her perceptions of me, and while part of me wanted to stay angry at her for choosing his word over mine for so many years, another part recognized that manipulation is insidious precisely because it makes otherwise good people complicit in cruelty they don't fully understand. I forgave her, not because the hurt disappeared overnight, but because I understood that holding on to resentment would only give David continued power over my emotional landscape, and I was done letting him occupy space in my head. The company thrived under my leadership, not because I was trying to prove anything to anyone anymore, But because my grandfather had been right, I was ready, I was capable, and I'd been ready for a long time while everyone else was too busy listening to David's narrative to notice. What I learned through this entire experience is that reclaiming your voice isn't a single dramatic moment. It's 1,000 small decisions to trust yourself, to document your truth, to prepare for battles you hope you'll never have to fight but know you might. My grandfather understood that, which is why he didn't just leave me an inheritance. He left me the tools, the training, and the evidence I'd need to defend what was rightfully mine against people who would always see me as less than simply because it served their interests to do so. Every time I walk into the office now, past the portrait of my grandfather that hangs in the lobby, I think about how he saw me clearly, when everyone else was looking through a distorted lens shaped by their own assumptions and prejudices. And I've made it my mission to do the same for others, to look for the people being dismissed, underestimated, or silenced, and to give them opportunities to prove what they're capable of when someone actually believes in them. So after hearing everything I went through, the years of being dismissed, the secret training, the courtroom confrontation, and ultimately reclaiming not just a company, but my entire sense of self, I want to ask you something important. What would you have done in my place? Would you have stayed silent like I did for so many years? Or would you have confronted your family earlier, even without the evidence to back you up? And here's the harder question. If you discovered that someone you loved had been systematically stealing and lying while making you look like the problem, would you have exposed them publicly the way I did? Or would you have tried to handle it privately to keep the family intact? I genuinely want to know your thoughts, because these aren't easy decisions, and there were moments during this whole process where I questioned whether I was doing the right thing or just feeding into a cycle of conflict that might never truly heal. If you've ever been silenced by people who should have supported you, if you've ever had your reality questioned by family members who found it easier to believe you were the problem than to face uncomfortable truths about themselves, then this story was for you. And I hope it reminded you that your voice matters, your truth is valid, and sometimes the people who dismiss you loudest are the ones most afraid of what you might become if you ever start believing in yourself. Hit that subscribe button if you want more stories about overcoming family betrayal, reclaiming your power, and turning the tables on people who underestimated you. Because trust me, I have more to share. Drop a like if you think my uncle got exactly what he deserved, or leave a comment if you think I should have handled things differently. I read every single one, and I love hearing different perspectives on these complicated situations. Before you go, I want to tell you about the next video I'm working on, and honestly, it might be even more intense than this one. It's about a woman who discovered her sister had been catfishing her fiancé for months, trying to sabotage the wedding, and the absolutely brilliant way she exposed the whole scheme at the rehearsal dinner in front of both families. The revenge was so perfectly calculated, so devastatingly effective, that even I was sitting there with my mouth open when I heard how it all went down. Make sure you're subscribed with notifications turned on so you don't miss it, because that story is going to have you questioning everything you thought you knew about family loyalty and how far people will go when jealousy takes over. Thank you so much for watching, for listening to my story, and for being part of this community where we can share these experiences and remind each other that we're not alone in dealing with toxic family dynamic. I'll see you in the next video. And remember, your truth is worth fighting for, even when, especially when, no one else seems to believe it.